can't get any more worse than it is. The fuel is melted through the nuclear reactor. It's lying on the floor, and it's boiling water as the water runs over it. That water has become incredibly radioactive. It's essentially in contact with radioactive plutonium and uranium and all those elements. And for all the units, they are simply running out of storage space. But Unit 1 is going to, that mass of bubbling hot uranium is going to gradually move down into the concrete, but I don't think there's enough energy to melt all the way through. But it really doesn't matter at this point because the radioactive material is leaving the containment. The containment has been breached. So Unit 2 is just as bad. There's a picture that came out yesterday of scalding hot water boiling up through a hole in the floor on Unit 1. That room, Helen, was 400 R an hour. In other words, it's lethal in 1 hour.
Okay, so let me tell people what an R is. An R is a REM. REM is a measurement of absorbed radiation dose into the body. If you receive a dose between 250 and 500 REMs, that is an LD50. In other words, a lethal dose for 50% of the population. You will die within a week or two with your hair falling out, vomiting and bleeding to death, like that man Litvinenko did, the Russian who was given some polonium. He died like that. So between 250 and 400 or 500. So you're saying, and that's in toto, you're saying that they are measuring 400 REMs per hour?
Yes.
At that site in Unit 1.
Right, and similarly in Unit 2. Unit 2 still has the roof on, and it's so humid and so physically hot and so radioactively hot that nobody can go into it. So Unit 1 and 2 are as bad as they're going to get, are not getting any better, but I don't think, I think they're just going to continue to ooze liquid and spray steam into the environment for months to come. Unit 3 is a little bit different. There's still a possibility of a steam explosion in Unit 3.
How so? How so?
Well, because not all of the core melted through, and there's a chance if a large hunk of core falls into the water under it, it could create a steam explosion. Unit 3's fuel pool and Unit 4's fuel pool are structurally so incredibly weak that I think my biggest fear now is a seismic aftershock. And if you remember the Sumatra earthquake of 4 or 5 years ago, that was a 9, just like Japan's, and there was a 8.6 3 months later. So Japan is not out of the woods as far as major aftershocks. Unit 4 is tilting, and Unit 3 is pretty much bombed out and destroyed. And a major earthquake could cause those fuel pools to fall. My advice to my friends in Japan is if you hear that fuel pool has collapsed, leave. Because there's no science here. No one ever thought of nuclear fuel lying on the ground and not being able to be cooled in a nuclear fuel pool. So we are beyond the point where anyone has ever analyzed if the fuel pools collapse. So if there's a major earthquake that causes the buildings to topple, my advice is leave.
Yeah, that's if you could get a plane out. I mean, maybe you should leave now. Because can't you imagine? I mean, there will be panic if people understand, and everyone lining up at the airport to get on planes, and there won't be enough planes.
Yeah, that's a major concern. And I don't know why TEPCO isn't frantically trying to reinforce that building. Obviously, it's so radioactive, it's difficult. But
what, this Unit 4 or Unit 3?
Unit 4.
Right.
Unit 4.
Right.
Frantically get in there and shore it up with concrete and steel and stuff like that to prevent the unimaginable from occurring. But that has not happened. So,
and what about the winds and the rain blowing now south over Japan?
Yeah, well, now the plants are emitting radiation every day, and that wind now, instead of heading out to sea predominantly, is now heading toward Tokyo. So we're seeing hot particles on the roadways. we're seeing hot particles in Tokyo now. There's a group of people who are monitoring, in lieu of the government, there's a group of people out there monitoring radiation and are basically developing a map of what's really occurring in Tokyo. Just 2 days ago, a university professor discovered plutonium a mile off-site in the soil. And about the same time, a group of inspectors found radiation in the ditches on the sides of the road to the tune of 10 millirem an hour, which is 200 times normal background. So it's falling onto the road, being washed into the ditches, and the ditches have become highly radioactive.
Oh, my God. What I don't understand, though, Arnie, is why... I know, so they were protecting their, as we'd say in Australia, protecting their asses. So they didn't want people to know, but wouldn't you have thought that they would have invited the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, all the organisations in at the beginning to help them work out what on earth to do right at the start?
Well, again, if you look at the IAEA's charter, it's to promote nuclear power.
So they don't care about safety, but their charter does say it's got to be safe.
Yes,
as well.
But they have that split. They have that split charter where one they're promoting and two they're determining if it's safe. And we both know that doesn't work.
So they're being wicked. They're being wicked too. I mean, really wicked. And the other thing is that what you just said, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was sitting a day or two after the whole thing started saying they thought that the whole of the northern Japan could become uninhabitable. That's an amazing... Was that in the Wall Street Journal, Arnie?
That was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. And it didn't say the NRC. It said the State Department was talking to the Japanese ambassador and trying to tell him the severity of the accident in his country. Now, the State Department doesn't have radiation experts. They were obviously getting that information
from the NRC.
The NRC, right.
Well, why isn't Hillary Clinton being more honest?
Well, Hillary Clinton, after Fukushima, entered a pact with the Japanese to buy more material. So again, the short-term commercial interests seem to be driving.
Buy what sort of material?
Food and trucks and cars. But it was, as I recall, predominantly food and fish and things like that. It was an attempt to show the population of both countries that everything was fine.
How are we going to break through these people's psychic numbings, Arnie?
I think the Internet is the difference, Helen, and I hope it is.
Oh.
I am constantly receiving reports that I pass on to other experts with data that over time will substantiate the magnitude of the releases, and then we can go back in and pin down what populations are at risk. And hopefully, give them the appropriate medical treatment.
There's no medical treatment, Arnie. I'm sorry, but once people have been contaminated with radioactive material, you can't get it out of their bodies. There's no medical treatment. And then people are writing to me and saying, well, what do I eat? What do I feed my children? Well, you are right. You've been saying, stay off milk products because milk, in fact, does bioconcentrate radioactive iodine and strontium and cesium. That's right. But then they've got to eat. And the vegetables concentrated. And the fruit concentrates it. And it falls into the water. The tea is concentrating the material in Japan now. You can't run. It's a kind of biblical ghastliness that once it's happened, there's no retreat. There's nothing you can do to change it.
Well, I'm most concerned about the fish. We're seeing, Woods Hole has said that the radioactive releases into the ocean are 10 times higher than the radioactive releases into the Baltic after Chernobyl.
Yeah. And
we're already seeing fish as far away as Hong Kong being detected with iodine. And high concentrations of cesium in fish as far away as 200 to 300 kilometers now. Now, those fish will work their way up the food chain into, the tuna and the salmon and the top of the food chain animals, and we'll see bioaccumulation over the next year as the cesium and as the strontium works its way up the food chain.
Well, and it's not just cesium and strontium, Arnie, that's pouring out into the ocean. I mean, wouldn't there be more than 100 different isotopes or radioactive elements like tellurium and zinc and calcium and all sorts of radioactive elements being poured in en masse into the ocean and there to bioconcentrate up through the the algae, the crustaceans, the little fish, the big fish, the tuna, the salmon. I mean, by orders of magnitude, there's bioconcentration at each step. So it's not just the cesium and strontium. Arnie, would you like to name a few of the other elements that are not often talked about?
Yeah, no, I think you just nailed them, and polonium is another one. And I think, and again, we are not monitoring fish. And sooner or later, a shipment of tuna is going to fire off a radiation alarm as it enters the United States.
Well, if they've got a radiation alarm, because they don't...
Well, our ports are monitored for terrorists.
I know,
so,
but...
we'll pick it up in a terrorist radiation alarm.
Think so?
And we'll say, oh, my God, it's the tuna. I think that will happen in the next year to year and a half.
Well, what about the tuna being bought in Washington State, or caught, or the fish, or, because fish swim thousands of miles. And I hear that the EPA is not monitoring the fish that are being caught on the West Coast. Is that correct?
No, they're not. I think it's a little too early for measurable amounts.
Yeah.
The ocean currents have not carried much of the radiation to the east, to the West Coast, and the bioaccumulation hasn't worked its way up the food chain too much. I think it's about a year out before we wind up with contaminated fish on the West Coast of the U.S.
Now, what about, you live in you live in Vermont, and radioactive fallout is being detected in Massachusetts and in Vermont, in milk and the like. Tell us your scenario if there really is another major aftershock or a collapse of one of the reactor molten fuel masses, and there's a steam explosion, a hydrogen explosion, or whatever. And, what do you think could happen in the United States, or is it because the winds now have turned from blowing east to west across the US to blowing south over Japan? You think that'll make the US relatively safe because the climatic conditions have altered?
No, I think you said it right earlier. You can run, but you can't hide at this point. These particles at a micron or 2 or 3 microns are small enough that they will get up in the jet stream and carry the way into the States and into Europe. So I'm not convinced that things like cesium and strontium, but that whole witch's brew that you discussed won't get here. Now, will you be able to stand outside with a radiation detector and say, "Oh my God, there's a lot"? No, it's all about hot particles and ingesting a particle that then causes a lot of local damage in a lung or a GI tract or a pancreas or a bone. That leads to a cancer. But it's never going to be something where you can stand outside with your Geiger counter and detect it, which makes it so insidious.
Oh, it's insidious and cryptogenic and silent and insidious. What do you call them, those hot particles? Nuclear fleas?
Fuel fleas.
Fuel fleas, yeah, that's the language that nuclear engineers use. What gets me is that nuclear engineers know all this stuff, and I found it fascinating, your latest video, Arnie. You were talking about evacuation and how the NRC calculates how much radiation will get out if there's a meltdown, and you said that they determine that if there's a meltdown, only 1% of the melted material will escape, right? And then of that, I don't know, they cut it down so finely, and using those totally artificial estimates, they then work out who should be evacuated from where and from how far out from the plant. I mean, that was an amazing thing to me, Arnie.
Well, no, thank you. Yeah,